I can tell you no, I don't remember. The session is now open. First of all, I wanted to ask if the minutes of the previous session held on June 29, 2026, which have been made available to you beforehand, can be approved. If so, by assent, it is approved. Today, we are hearing from the third Vice President of the Government and Minister for Ecological Transition in her capacity as former member of the Management Board of the Solvency Support Fund for Strategic Companies, Ms. Sara Aagesen Munoz, to provide information regarding the purpose of the Commission. Ms. Sara Aagesen Munoz appears before this investigative commission, created pursuant to a Senate plenary resolution adopted on January 15, 2026. The purpose of this commission is to investigate and, if applicable, determine the existence of political responsibilities arising from the actions carried out by the State Industrial Holdings Company, SEPI, from May 2018 to the present, with special attention to the processes of granting aid, subsidies, public equity stakes, business bailouts, and other financial support instruments managed directly or indirectly by this entity. Her appearance takes place in compliance with the Commission's work plan and in accordance with the provisions of Organic Law 5/1984 of May 24 regarding appearances before the investigation committees of the Congress and the Senate or of both chambers. In accordance with that law and under the terms of the summons that was served on her, this Commission has required her appearance to provide information to it regarding the subject of the investigation. Parliamentary investigation, with the person appearing being subject to the obligation derived from Article 502.3 of the Penal Code not to lie in her testimony, all of this without prejudice to the constitutional rights of the person appearing. She has also been informed, in accordance with that law, of the possibility of appearing accompanied by a person to assist her. Regarding the development of the hearing, since it is public, it begins with the sponsoring group, the parliamentary group, the popular parliamentary group. Right? Mr. Hernando, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Welcome, sorry. Welcome, Madam Vice President of the Government, Madam Aagesen. I thank you for your presence here on my behalf and on behalf of my group, and I thank you in advance for the answers that I am convinced we will get to clarify this whole matter. Look, Madam Aagesen, just a week ago we woke up to the indictment by Judge Pedras, who, as you know, is investigating the dirty dealings of the PSOE. Of 25 new names that link the case of Leire and Uroc, that is Vicente Fernandez and Anshon Alonso, with SEPI, and the bailout of Tubos Reunidos, among those indicted, the current president of SEPI. SEPI and also many officials or former officials, too many, from the entity itself and from some companies in which it holds stakes, such as Enusa or Mercasa. These add to the nearly endless list of others already indicted for SEPI-related matters. The case of the former president Vicente Fernandez, the case of Bartolomé Lora, vice president, the case of the president of Forestalia, Fernando Sansampero, and even José Luro de Zapatero himself. Amid this storm of indictments and criminal cases, a certain feeling is inevitable, as you understand. The perception that nothing of what is being seen and judged in court regarding SEPI has been accidental or the result of merely individual behaviors, but rather the result of an operation that was there from the beginning, deliberately built to avoid obstacles to corruption and structured to favor, when the time came, arbitrariness, shady deals, and the enrichment of a chosen few. So SEPI has been reduced, I'm sorry to say, by this government and by the network surrounding it, to a mere lever for corruption under the pretext of bailouts or other excuses, always at the expense of public money. Little by little, however, things are starting to make sense, and we're in a situation where we even have to start questioning the very mechanism the government used to launch aid for strategic companies. For example, the creation of a single ad hoc financial instrument for aid to strategic companies and the exclusively political centralization of rule-bound decisions. The outrageous secrecy imposed on the documents. This, which prevents establishing the technical traceability of the bailouts, are characteristic and specific anomalies of the Spanish model and have no counterpart in the instruments developed and implemented by other European Union states, which, as a rule, have been much more transparent, much more traceable, and generally also quite a bit more successful, with the added fact that in those cases there have been zero charges of corruption. If you have been called to this committee, it is basically because you were one of the members, as you know, of the Management Council of the Aid Fund and therefore responsible for all its decisions. And I remind you that some of them are under judicial scrutiny, and in fact, too many of them. Of course, your political responsibility is complete, and it will be up to the courts to determine and decide if there are other forms of liability to be determined. And with this, if you agree, let's move on to the questions. The first questions will be purely for verification in order to confirm some facts that I believe are known to everyone. The first is that, indeed, you were an ex officio member of the Funds Management Council from its creation until you stepped down as Secretary of State in November 2024, and therefore you voted in favor of the bailouts of Air Europa, Plus Ultra, and Tubos Reunidos. Is that correct?
It is true that I was part of the Management Council until I was appointed Vice President of the government while I was serving as Secretary of State. What is not true is the vote in favor. I was not able to be present for that. In that Tubos Reunidos meeting, in this case, it was delegated to the Undersecretary of the Ministry for the Ecological Transition. In this case, as you know as well, yes.
I didn't know that, but you know perfectly well. And the legal regime of delegation in Spain determines that the acts carried out by delegation will be understood as done by the delegator. So I understand that you consider yourself equally responsible for that decision, right?
I understand that it was a decision made with all the criteria that had to be met.
Yes, we'll get to that later. Excuse me for the question I'm about to ask, and I anticipate the answer. I just want it to be on the record. Were you aware of the importance of your role given what was at stake? Did you take it seriously? Did you study the matters? Were you aware of the circumstances of the operations at the time of voting on the bailouts?
Of course, we were in an extraordinarily complex context, as you know, and there was a situation resulting from the COVID crisis that was affecting the country's productive and industrial base. Therefore, it was an instrument endorsed by Europe, but specifically dedicated so that those companies in an extraordinary situation could be helped and supported.
Yes, but the question was whether you took your role seriously and therefore studied the matters and knew the circumstances of each of the operations. That was the question.
Obviously, the decisions made in the Management Council, based on all the reports, were preceded by collective work carried out by the teams from the Ministry for the Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge.
So the answer is yes, that you took it seriously and studied it?
The answer is that the government and all the members of the Management Council took it seriously. And in the case of the Ministry, I insist, we had important collective work.
Did you receive, prior to each council session, the information and documentation provided for in the internal rules that you yourselves approved?
I understand that there were procedures that were informative and other meetings that were for making decisions. The documentation was different.
But in any case, did you receive the documentation that was required by the rules?
We, the members of the Council, received it.
How much notice, roughly? You can't say?
Depending on the files, sometimes days before, sometimes weeks before, depending on how ready the files were.
Did it include, for example, the reports issued by the SEPI departments in the preliminary phase, that is, the one that ended with the acceptance or rejection of the company's applications? Did it include that information in your report?
There were preliminary reports from the SEPI departments, and there were also external reports, as you know, right? Yes.
No, I'm talking about the internal ones. I'm talking about the SEPI ones. There were. And I'm talking about the ones from the preliminary phase.
There were preliminary reports. I don't remember if they were complete on every occasion. What is clear is that the reports had to be complete when it came to a decision-making phase.
Yes, but we'll address that phase later. Right now, I'm asking about the preliminary reports. Since you haven't mentioned their existence, were they signed by the technicians who prepared them?
The truth is that I don't know the details of that information you're asking me about right now.
It also included the reports you referred to, the ones the Court of Auditors calls opinion reports, signed by the technicians responsible for the SEPI departments prior to the adoption of the final agreements. They were included as well.
I'll repeat, I don't know exactly what information reached each committee in each case.
No, I'm talking about the reports that are included in the procedural rules approved by you.
I understand that they were arriving depending on the progress of the files. There wasn't, I insist, it depended on each file. There could be one informational meeting, two informational meetings, so it could be that in some of them not all the information was complete and it would arrive in the next one. I don't know.
SEPI department reports were signed by the authors, department heads, or technicians involved.
I think you've already asked me that question. Right now, I don't remember if they were signed. What is clear is that when the decision was made, they had to be signed, of course.
Did you read the reports from the external advisors and the SEPI technical reports yourself?
We had a team, as I mentioned, within the ministry to be certain all the criteria were being met.
The question is if you read them yourself.
On some occasions, yes. As you know, I have told you and indicated to you, there have been other cases, such as Tubos Reunidos, which you mentioned, where, because of the circumstances, I couldn't attend those meetings.
Were you aware of the content of the financial support agreements approved by the Management Council?
The content was presented in the meetings.
So I understand that you were aware of it.
No?
I'm not asking if you had it memorized, which is impossible. I'm asking if you were more or less familiar with the basic general terms of the financial support agreements.
The basic terms that were being discussed in those meetings you attended.
At any point, were you aware of any internal SEPI reports that were unfavorable or had reservations regarding any of the operations that you eventually voted in favor of? No, I never did. There was never any report, no SEPI report of an unfavorable nature ever reached the management board. Yes.
If you mean if anything unfavorable happened, what?
Contrary to an operation that you later voted in favor of?
No, I didn't have any unfavorable reports.
In the operations where the aid was approved, all the reports presented to the CP Management Council were favorable.
Right? They were favorable reports, but just to clarify, excuse me. Out of the 74 companies that applied, you know that the entry point was SEPI. 34 withdrew along the way, but there were 10.
That were not admitted.
Exactly.
No, that's right. Well, more than they allow you.
Unfavorable, inadmissible, unfavorable.
I asked you about the 30 that were actually voted on.
30 favorable.
All reports sent to the Management Council were favorable, correct?
All the reports were favorable.
On 5 occasions, it seems that guests attended with the right to speak and vote, which was a possibility provided for by the regulations. Interestingly, and this is a curiosity, there are many others involving Air Europa, but anyway, 4 of these 5 visits were linked to the Air Europa bailout. But that's not the question. We'll discuss Air Europa later. The real question is, who invited these guests? The Management Council or the ministries? Do you remember?
I don't remember the motivation behind those invitations, but what I do remember is that the regulations allowed for guests to attend.
Yes, no, well, in this case, what's strange is that 4 out of the 5 noted by the Court of Auditors were related to Air Europa. And the next question is, why did they stop inviting people using this specific clause of the regulation after the Europa bailout? Because there were 57 subsequent sessions in which there were no guests with speaking and voting rights once the Europa bailout was over. Do you know the reason? Just yes or no?
No, I don't know the reason.
Did you receive directly or indirectly any instructions, suggestions, or communications from the Prime Minister's office, the Economic Office of Moncloa, ministers, or their cabinets regarding how you should vote in any of the fund's operations?
I never received any instructions. Any instructions.
Ninguna indicación.
Well, if you agree, let's move on to the Europa bailout. 475 million approved on November 3rd, 2020. The Europa bailout, as you know, I suppose you knew at the time, was processed and approved in 74 days, when the average later was 355, 5 times more from the request. Were you given any justification, I mean technical, not political, for this unusual speed for the Europa process?
I wasn't given any justification. From what I understand, files reached the SEPI desk as they were ready and were submitted that way. That's the interpretation I have, yes.
Well, precisely, speaking of that speed, did you ever get the impression that most of the work was already done and that, moreover, there was a particular rush to finish it? No.
I didn't have any sense of rushing or anything like that in this regard.
Did Mr. Lora inform you that he had held 4 meetings with Globelia officials in June and July of 2020?
No, not to my knowledge.
You are not aware of it. This is information from a statement made by Bartolomé Lora himself in court number 49 in the case opened by Europa. When you voted on November 3, 2020, were you aware of the alleged interest of then Minister Ábalos in the operation, or the alleged contacts of Mr. Aldama, or people from Globalia with members of the government, or relatives of President Sánchez? No. Did anyone from the Ministry of Transport contact you at any point? Are you part of Ábalos' circle or Globalia's circle? No, never, never.
Nunca.
Did Mr. Lora inform you that he had a meeting with Minister Ábalos at the end of August 2020 at the request of the Ministry of Economy regarding the Europa matter?
I insist. I know nothing about that meeting.
No, that's the question. If Mr. Laura informed you about that meeting, which it seems did take place, no. Did Ana de la Cueva, Secretary of State for Economy, and your colleague on the management board tell you about this meeting?
I have no knowledge of that either.
You have no knowledge of it? Thank you. There is a fact that is truly curious in this case file on Europa, like many others. I already mentioned that 4 of the 5 guests in the 62 sessions were involved in the Europa rescue. There's another interesting fact. Were you aware of it? I said, look, the external financial report for the case file on Europa was awarded by SEPI for 0.01 euro. That is 1 cent, which is basically enough to pay for a couple of blank sheets of paper. As far as we know, to the company Pricewaterhouse, when the average cost was 10 million or more than that, it was 104,000 euros according to the data from the Court of Auditors. Did Mr. Laura explain this circumstance to you? No. Also, what's curious is that this report was completed in 19 days, which is a record, when the average was 70. There were 2 reports that were completed in 3-4 months. Did it seem strange to you in this context, where it seems like everything had to be rushed in the Air Europa case?
No, I'll say it again. You're talking about standards. I understand this was the first operation that reached EPIC, so comparing it with something that happened in the future is impossible.
Right, no, but well, you already know what happened afterwards because you were part of the management board.
No, that's why I'm saying I have no knowledge that it was expedited or that there was discriminatory treatment.
Yes. Excuse me. The direct recipient of the aid in the form of loans in this operation was, as you know, Air Europa Holding. This is also stated in the 5th stipulation of the financial support agreement, which you said you knew, where Air Europa Holding is the direct recipient of the financing. And this is the real elephant in the room. Because the question is, how is it possible that you decided to grant loans to a financial company when both the Temporary Framework and Royal Decree Law 25/2020, as well as the agreement of the Council of Ministers from July 23rd? It's not that they explicitly exclude financial companies, it's that financial companies are the very first thing they exclude. How is it possible that a loan was granted to a financial company?
If you look at the file, we're talking about a company from a sector, in this case, the airline sector, airline companies that were especially affected by the impact of COVID. Therefore, that's the context. All the reports state that we're talking about an airline company.
Yes, the problem is that Air Europa Holding was not an airline company. It was a holding company. And furthermore, I'll tell you, the CEO or Secretary of the Board of Globalidad himself, who sat where you are now, Ramiro Campos, had to admit that Air Europa Holding was indeed a financial company. Basically because I showed him the public deed of incorporation where the corporate purpose is stated. None of them were related to the development of aeronautical activities, but rather to financing. He said it was minimal, but it was a financial company. And I repeat the same question. How is it possible that something like that slipped through? And besides, I'm going to tell you something else. The loan was structured in such a way that it went to Air Europa Holding, a financial company, and therefore excluded, which in turn was bound by the financing contract. In turn, to draw up 2 contracts, actually 4 contracts, for the participatory and ordinary loans to Aeronova and Air Europa. Airlines later on, so it was not only a financial company, but also, in addition, it was required to act as a financial company with respect to the airlines in which it held shares.
I insist again. The reports we received from the SEPITAM departments and the internal audits indicated that the 13 eligibility criteria are being met. And in this case, that criterion is being fulfilled.
It was fulfilled. No one in your ministry was surprised. They said, this can't be. No one. No. We are going to keep talking about Air Europa Holding because another issue is that Air Europa Holding was a company that had been established less than a year earlier, in November 2019, under a different name. Air Europa Holding was named that on December 17, 2019. Look, it's all just a coincidence. And also, on that date, in December, is when it was given the full 100% endowment and of the shares of Air Europa, Airlines, and Aeronova. The question is, didn't you notice the fraud involved in creating this ad hoc company as a corporate firewall with Globalia, considering that Globalia was excluded from the equation and couldn't access it either because it had tax debts? Didn't you notice the huge corporate fraud behind Air Europa's request, which seems obvious to me?
Air Europa, I assure you no one.
No one got into this matter.
No one got into this matter, and moreover, any irregular behavior would have been reported by us.
It's clear. No, yes, I didn't know they would have reported it, but the issue is it happened. The circumstances I'm describing are exactly what occurred. The holding company acted as a firewall with respect to Globalia. Globalia couldn't access the bailout because it had tax debts. And holding was created very conveniently and in an unusual way. And it was precisely holding that received the aid in what is clearly a blatant corporate fraud, in which I have to say you have participated. I think I would have to study it more carefully. Look, the 49th Investigating Court of Madrid is investigating the bailout of Air Europa for alleged administrative misconduct. They've requested the Management Council board members' names. My question is, have you been required, summoned, or informed about this case? No. Not yet? No. You have no updates or information?
No, I insist. You talk about the compatibility of the aid with the principles and criteria, and I would like to, and I think you know it perfectly well. There is a report from the Court of Auditors that fully supports the compliance with the criteria. Therefore,
yes, no, I have read the report from the Court of Auditors, and in fact, much of the information I have obtained comes from it. The issue with the Court of Auditors report, apart from all the problems posed by the Court of Auditors, is that its conclusions don't match the report's actual content. But anyway, we can talk about it later if you want. Today, without a doubt, and in light of what you have shown, you maintain that the bailout of Europa met all the requirements. You maintain and affirm this, right?
yes, all the criteria, I insist. The 13 eligibility criteria were documented in reports from the SEPI departments and external advisors, and those reports were submitted to the members of the Management Board.
Do you know, or are you aware, or do you remember if Mr. Manuel de la Rocha or any other official from the Prime Minister's office attended the session? I don't know if it was on October 29 or November 3, 2020, where the bailout of Europa was approved. Do you remember?
The truth is, I don't remember.
It's just that Mr. de la Rocha himself has actually admitted it, that Mr. de la Rocha participated. Of course, the problem we have is, what is the head of the Moncloa Economic Office doing in the bailout of Europa when it's not any of the ministries directly affected by that bailout? It's not transport, it's not tourism, it's not industry, so you don't remember.
I don't remember, but I insist. Was the mechanism in place to allow for other members to be part of the Management Council? Yes. What is it in place for?
At the Management Council's request.
With voice and vote.
That is, he appeared because you requested it.
I understand that Mr. de la Rocha has certain duties. Let me remind you that he was the director of the Economic Office, a person who has information about the strategic importance of the companies. Up-to-date information on so many important developments in our country.
If Manuel de la Rocha attended, it was because the Management Council requested it.
I insist, if Manuel de la Rocha was there, I understand that it was considered appropriate for him to be present.
So you don't remember? It's not that you can say yes or no, you just don't remember.
Honestly, let me repeat, and the truth is we're talking about events that happened, meetings that took place more than 5 years ago. So I don't have the traceability you're asking me for.
The minutes are there, which I assume you have access to, and that you must have reviewed to prepare for a hearing as important as this one.
I have prepared everything I could given the importance of this session. Of course I have.
But you haven't looked at the minutes then?
All the documents from all the sessions, I assure you.
I see, excuse me.
But I don't understand it.
Speaking of possible external influences, I suppose you are aware of the information that Pedro Saura, Secretary of State for Transport, the day after the bailout request. I'm not talking about actions that affect you. I'm just going to ask you something else. On August 7, 2020, he issued a press release anticipating a favorable outcome for the bailout the day after the request. He himself says that he did it at the request of Aldama, who showed up at his office with Javier Hidalgo, CEO of Globalia, and whom he received at Cordo's request. Well, everyone is involved here. This is a poker game among all of them. The question is, were you aware of this kind of maneuvering?
No.
Did you receive, either directly or through Teresa Rivera, who was your minister, any request, recommendation, or requirement from the circle of Ábalos, Hidalgo, Cordo, etc.? None.
None, absolutely none.
If you agree, let's move on to the Plus Ultra bailout. 53 million, March 9, 2021. You voted in favor of the bailout of Plus Ultra. The Court of Auditors mentions unanimity in all the votes, but the Court of Auditors also notes that there is no record of the deliberations in the minutes. Did you make any reservation, objection, or request for additional information in the sessions related to the bailout of Plus Ultra?
No, I don't recall any request for additional information in this regard.
Do you recall how many reports were sent to the Management Council about Plus Ultra's strategic importance?
Right now, I don't remember how many, but at least 2.
Yes, well, it's 2. That's what the Court of Auditors says. Look, one is from Aagesen and the other is from the Directorate General of Civil Aviation. The president of Aagesen was also the Director General of Civil Aviation. That is, apparently both reports were signed by the same person and both depended on Abalos' ministry. Everything turns out to be very convenient. And it turns out that Air Europa, whose strategic nature I have no doubt about, and Plus Ultra, about whose strategic nature I have serious doubts, are among the 5-6, if we count Boris. Airlines that applied for and obtained the bailout, these are the only 2 that have in common that they only received 2 reports, which was actually 1, certifying the strategic nature of both. Doesn't it seem strange to you that these were the only 2 that had just 2 reports, which was actually 1 about their strategic nature, considering that they are also the only 2 that have generated legal cases around them?
I can tell you that it didn't seem strange to me, and I would also like to point out that, as I mentioned earlier, the European Commission itself spoke about the strategic nature of the sector. No,
the strategic sector is obvious, but what had to be considered strategic was the company. That's what was stated in the Royal Decree Law and in the agreement of the Council of Ministers. But look, just to give you an example, in the case of Air Nostrum, we're talking about other airlines, reports about the strategic nature, obviously civil aviation, the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, but also the Valencian Institute of Economic Research and the Department of Finance in the Generalitat. In the case of Volotea Civil Aviation, also involved are the City Council of La Coruña, Asturias Deputy Ministry of Infrastructure, Bilbao Chamber of Commerce, Canary Islands Department of Tourism, Gran Canaria Council, and Murcia Department of Tourism. Ultimately, what needed to be proven was that the company itself was strategic, regardless of whether the sector was strategic, which it obviously was, like many others. But that doesn't mean that the companies are strategic. For Vamos and Bamboria Boris, the State Secretariat for Tourism, a separate ministry, also reports on the matter. And I repeat, don't you find it strange, considering what we already know, that the 2 cases focus on Europa and Plus Ultra, which actually had the weakest basis? A documentary in Europa, because everything was rushed, apparently, and Plus Ultra, because there wasn't much else to dig into. Doesn't that seem strange to you?
I'll start again. You say that there was a lot of urgency here. I'm saying that I'm not aware of the rush you're referring to. And regarding the reports on strategic status, they existed and were sectoral reports, as you have also indicated. So, of course, it was not my personal role, nor my role within the management board, to question something that comes from the sector.
Well, I think that, let's talk about that. Well, I do think it is your role to assess the importance of the reports on strategic status. But look, speaking precisely about that, we know that Abalos allegedly, of course, was not convinced by the bailout of Plus Ultra because it was very hard to justify in any way. And after all, Villa Parra's house was allegedly paid for through Globalia's dealings, while the interest in Plus Ultra was also allegedly José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero and his network. And here we're talking about rival networks like Cosa Nostra families in New York. And here comes the next question. Are you aware of the AESA report on the strategic nature of Plus Ultra? It refrained from recommending the bailout, citing the limited significance of Plus Ultra, which only accounted for 0.1% of passengers. In Spain, it ranked 77th, 95% of the users were non-Spanish, and moreover, AESA had serious doubts about the execution of the viability plan. Are you aware of this?
Are you aware? I am not aware.
Neither of us is aware. I'm telling you because this is clearly a confidential report. But nevertheless, it has been included in the dossier of the case opened in court number 15 and later in Judge Calama's case, which raises serious doubts about the information the Management Council had when making its decisions, at least regarding a fundamental aspect of the bailout, which was its strategic nature. Do you know Mr. Manuel Zulueta? Does that name ring a bell?
No.
Look, Mr. Manuel Zulueta is the CEO of Advisory, of C Advisory, which is the external financial advisor that was involved in the rescue of Plus Ultra. I'm saying this to give you some context. He is the one who prepared the report from the external financial advisors, which, as you know, was complemented by the legal report. Well, Mr. Manuel Zulueta made a statement in El Mundo's Actualidad Económica, on May 30, 2021, and I believe I'm reading this literally. The external advisors deliberately avoided recommending the bailout because they couldn't verify the truthfulness of the documentation provided, and instead, they gave a guide to the management board so that they could carry out their own investigations. Are you aware that it happened this way?
No, you are not aware. In fact,
She's not aware, she doesn't remember, she denies it, she's not aware, she's not aware.
I insist, I am not aware. And what I wanted to tell you is that all the deliberations of the management board were based on the reports submitted by the units and also by external experts.
That's why I want to insist. I've already given you some information. This information, they avoided recommending the bailout and simply said, here's the information and you can draw your own conclusions. Could it have been like that?
I insist, each and every one of the criteria was endorsed with a favorable assessment, all 13 criteria. Therefore, that is what was submitted to the management board before being able to make a favorable decision regarding any of the operations. Let's see if you remember anything.
Look, I don't know.
If you allow me, excuse me, you keep talking about a bailout, and I would like to say that if the interpretation of bailout means help in a context where companies needed assistance for their viability.
It means exactly that.
Ma'am, perfect, just to clarify.
It means that the problem is that, for example, the Secretary of the Council refused to talk about a bailout. It seems the idea of a bailout didn't fit his own view of the company's situation, but we maintain that it was clearly a bailout. I already know.
But understood as something they had to pay back. It's not a grant, but a repayment.
Of course, well, Plus Ultra hasn't paid back any of the capital yet, as far as we know, and therefore they're already failing to meet the repayment deadlines. Look, I don't know the C Advisory report because it's confidential, but let's see if you remember it. I bet that, first, the requirement of not being a company in crisis or not being subject to dissolution was met. According to this report, for sure, it's a personal bet. Let's see if you remember. Thanks to the 6 million loan from Panacorp, which in the end is the cornerstone of the whole operation. It was clear it was a major fraud with minimal investigation. That's what Mr. Martin Molina, the court expert in the open case who also testified here, did. I make that bet with you. And since you know the report, you can inform me. And secondly, I also bet you that the report, just as Mr. Manuel Zulueta says, was prepared exclusively with information from the Provincialidad and a company whose executives are of impeccable honesty, except for the small detail that they are all implicated in corruption cases. And furthermore, some of them are connected to the darkest cases of Bolivarian Venezuela. And of course, there's Zapatero as well, who is a guarantee of moral integrity in every sense. Can you confirm these 2 points?
All the information you are talking about, I am completely unaware of it.
They are completely unaware of it.
Completely. And what I do want to tell you, and I insist again, each and every one of the operations, every single one of them, has been backed by the Court of Auditors. Thank you.
Well, I repeat again, that's very doubtful. Still.
If I may, I'm reading exactly what the court's report says. No.
Yes, I know it perfectly well. I have it here, actually. I know. That's why. But you should also know that our group is going to request operational reports on the content of the operations from the Court of Auditors, precisely because the general report on operations covering 3 billion euros is not detailed enough. And I repeat, the Court of Auditors contains many, many inconsistencies in its own content. And on February 26, 2021, before the Management Council met, Mr. Julio Martinez, Julito, a partner of Zapatero, informed the partner from Plus Ultra, Mr. Camilo Ibrahim. This is, according to the UDEF report, how the aid was obtained. How do you explain that the result of a decision by the Management Council could be communicated, a couple of weeks earlier?
I can't explain it. I can't explain it, obviously, nor do I know the content of that information. But I can explain, obviously.
I have no explanation.
Nor do I know any of those
people. Okay, yes, I understand. The same day the Management Council submitted the proposal, there was an intermediary, I won't say the name, who informed the network in this case Julio Martinez, again Julito, these are the exact words, that everything had already been approved and that the publication would be on March 9th. This is also information that appears in the UD reports. Did you in any way detect any kind of leaks? Was any internal investigation opened regarding these possible leaks within the Management Council?
As far as I know, we weren't aware of any kind of leak, and as far as I know, although I understand why you would ask.
Are you talking about the information from UD? Of course, everything was in an embryonic stage and...
Of course, not information.
I always mean allegedly, and if I don't say it, I want it understood that way.
Well, I have no knowledge of this information, nor of its accuracy, nor did I have any information about it, so that's the only thing I can tell you.
The first investigation, I don't know if you remember, was in court number 15 in Madrid. It says that it rules out the responsibility of the management board, which is good for you, due to its lack of decision-making power. Do you agree with this characterization? Were you there just to, I don't know, just to sign?
I believe that the functions that were defined for the management board were already very clear to us.
Yes, of course, and it included decision-making.
Decision based on the report submitted and the analysis, which was not done by the management board. That report, those reports. No.
I understand that the reports were not prepared by the management board.
The management board would submit it to the Council of Ministers for approval. The functions are clearly defined.
Then we know from the Minister of Finance, who was also sitting there, that they didn't read anything. She basically said it like that. You already know her. But basically she said that we don't read anything because it comes from the management board. So I understand that it was the management board who had to gather the documentation, analyze it, and vote based on an informed understanding of the circumstances of each operation.
I'll say the same thing again. The analysis of the information was done by the different units of SEPI. They were the ones who submitted the analysis of the 13 criteria and whether they were met to the management board. Therefore, indeed, that was the procedure that had been fully regulated.
Yes, absolutely regulated. Politicians made the decisions, but these were regulated, with the management board approving the operation and submitting it to the Council of Ministers for authorization.
The procedure is what it is, I insist, but based on information analyzed by the different units, not by us, the members of the management board.
Yes, of course, we agreed on that. You made decisions based on the information you received, which was logically provided by the management of SEPI, in this case by Bartolomé Lora or Belén Gualda, depending on the situation. Well...
And external advisors, yes.
The external advisors, indeed. Just to finish, and another question that I understand is also rhetorical, José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero is facing very, very serious charges, precisely linked to the Plus Ultra operation. You are aware of this? The question is whether Zapatero, José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, or someone from his circle, or someone who, according to the information we have, is among those accused in connection with the scheme. Did he contact you, or do you know if he did so with any other member of the management board to try to influence in any way the bailout of Plus Ultra, which was unacceptable from any point of view, whichever way you looked at it?
I assure you no.
You assure me that's not the case. Thank you. Now let's discuss the Tubos Reunidos bailout. 112 million approved on July 13, 2021. You said you weren't there for the vote, but frankly, in terms of administrative law, it makes no difference to me at all, because the delegate acts on behalf of the delegator, and furthermore, the delegator is responsible for the decisions of the delegate. According to a UKO report, this file is especially important because it's the only one that mentions you personally. Please explain the circumstances. If in a report from the UCO sent to the National Court, it says that you opposed the rescue of Tubos Reunidos in the session of June 15, 2021, which I assume was the preliminary session for ecological reasons. I'm reading literally. I confirm. Do you confirm that this is what happened?
No, I insist that's false. The ministry's opinion was not, in fact, it was not issued because we did not attend that meeting on June 15th, so the answer is no. No.
You didn't attend, but someone you sent as your delegate attended, right? No.
No one attended that meeting on behalf of the ministry. Yes.
But one question. I'm not talking about the meeting at which the vote took place, which was on July 13th. I'm talking about the preliminary meeting on June 15th. That is a month before the one you told us that no one from the ministry attended.
It's the opposite. No one from the ministry attended the previous meeting on June 15th. And the meeting that was attended was the one where the vote took place on July 13th, if I remember correctly.
Well, I think you said earlier that it was the meeting you didn't vote in because you weren't present at the voting meeting. Of course, this is the meeting prior to the vote.
The one who didn't attend was me, but I did delegate to the deputy secretary.
And no one attended the preliminary meeting on June 15th.
No one attended, we couldn't go.
But was there any valid reason?
Yes, there was a valid reason. We are in an extraordinarily complicated situation, as you know. I think you know it and have experienced it in recent years. At that time, we're talking about the beginning or middle of June in the year 2021, where all Spaniards and the industrial sector were experiencing what was, let's say, the first energy price crisis, with gas prices up by 300%. I've revisited it, as you can imagine. That affected market prices, electricity, and we were working on the first royal decree law of urgent measures precisely to address this energy price crisis. And as you can imagine, excuse me,
Minister, and excuse me as well, Mr. Hernando. The minister has the right to attend with a companion. You have come with a team, Madam Minister, who are giving you the answers from behind. Therefore, I kindly ask all those people who are supporting the minister to please refrain from making gestures. Thank you very much. The minister must answer here as he is appearing before this investigative committee. Thank you very much. Please go ahead, Mr. Hernando.
Yes, thank you, Madam President.
sorry, Madam President, I hadn't realized. No, I wasn't aware.
So, just to be clear, no one from the ministry attended the preliminary meeting on June 15, and you did not attend the meeting where the bailout was voted on July 13. Is that what's in the final version?
Thank you. Well, that's what happened. That's what happened. But what is true, excuse me to clarify, on July 13th, the Undersecretary attended as a delegate. In this case, on my behalf.
The Undersecretary from your department?
From the Ministry for Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge.
Thank you. Honestly, it's very difficult for me. Look, whether you attended or not, the truth is that someone set it in motion, apparently, according to what you say, and the records will be able to prove it. Did someone set in motion that you had denied or had stepped in for ecological reasons? And look, without you being there, without you being at that meeting, as stated in the report, and a series of frantic actions began, which are included in the UCO reports. Between June 15, based on that information, which you say is absolutely false and also impossible because you weren't there, and July 13, when the vote takes place. The UCO maintains that during that interval, the Irurok network, that is Vicente Fernandez, Lere Diaz, and Anchon, Alonso used political channels with the PNV through Mr. Alonso and Ferdan, who had influence in the PNV, to unblock the operation. Be aware of the reports that have come in, which concern information linked to a decision you were not able to make.
I'll say it again. Are you aware? What I can say is I have been aware of what has been published in various media outlets. I am aware of that publication. And that's what I have been able to see and read. That's the only information I have. But what I can assure you, and I want to stress, is that you have told me that it can't be. I'll say it again. On June 15th, 2021, I couldn't attend that meeting, which was informative, that's also important, and it was not a decision-making meeting. It was preliminary, as you know the procedure perfectly well, and I couldn't attend. And no one from the ministry attended either. So I want to make that clear to you. So, no, I didn't have the ability, nor do I have the ability to give you any thoughts about what happened at an informative management council meeting that I couldn't attend.
Could you send us the minutes from that day? Because I'm sure you have it among your documents to confirm that information.
All the information from the Management Council, as you know, and from the Solvency Fund, is kept by SEPI, and I believe I can certainly provide it to you.
So the hypothesis that stands out here, I believe, is that obviously the Irurok scheme was set in motion based on a fake news story to gain merit and allegedly later receive the corresponding kickbacks. That is a hypothesis that obviously I can't ask you to confirm. What you can confirm is that there was no one from the ministry from Mexico on June 15th. No one. Were you informed about that meeting? Were you informed?
There was no one. We were not specifically informed about that meeting, but later, as you know, as you also asked me at the beginning of this session, the reports supporting the different criteria from the various SEPI units started to arrive.
Yes.
Yes, and also the external advisors.
All right. Mrs. Gualda informed you because even though you weren't present in this initial phase, you were there later for the vote. Mrs. Gualda informed you about a meeting held in Moncloa regarding the rescue of Tubos Reunidos on July 8th. No. Didn't she inform you? No. Did you learn about that meeting elsewhere? No. You didn't know Ms. Gualda spoke about Tubos Reunidos on July 8th? Well, I'm telling you, all of this happened because of the mess that started from that information that apparently someone made up saying that you had proposed a vote against. No, I'm not asking for explanations about that. I'm just stating what happened. Of course, if that impossible story started circulating, the next question naturally comes up. Did you receive during those weeks any calls, meetings, or communications from the Basque government, from the PNV, from the Ministry of Finance, from Santos Cerdán, from Anchon Alonso, or from anyone else, urging you to change your mind based on that information? Excuse me.
Excuse me, and I want to be very clear again. Never in any case did I receive pressure to cast any vote. Never.
All right, just one thing, just for the record, so it's clear who is responsible for saying that you were there and that you were in disagreement. It appears so. Judge Pedraz's order identified the former president. Sorry, it was a member of SEPI, Mr. Figueroa, who gave it to the former president of SEPI, Mr. Fernandez, who was the one. In turn, according to the UCO, he set in motion this whole movement with the PNV to get you to change your mind. And I don't know if you know, probably yes, that the draft favorable resolution that your former secretary voted for, which was written by Rosario Martinez Manzanedo, seems to be, with the approval of Vice President Lora, with the approval and consent of the President, of President Gualda, because that's the initial procedure. It was sent to the Irurok network by Figueroa himself 24 hours before the meeting of the Management Council. That's why, by the way, all these people have recently been placed under investigation by Judge Pedraz at the request of the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. Are you aware of these leaks and these actions?
Of course not. I'm not aware of them.
Let's move to technical questions if you agree, since we have little time left. The Management Board analyzed, it was discussed in meetings, that this company had in 2019 an interest coverage ratio over EBITDA of minus 1.52. And therefore, it failed to meet one of the criteria, which was not being a company in crisis, according to Article 2.18 of Regulation 651, which you probably know.
I repeat, I insist again, the information that was submitted to this file and to the rest of the files that received a favorable vote had to meet all the criteria, all 13 criteria.
So, did you not even consider that the reports could have been somehow manipulated or intended to provide a negative image of the company?
I repeat, of course, I don't think so. I'm not an economic expert, but I assure you that the reports we received were issued by the competent institutions and, of course, with knowledge of the subjects.
Yes, but look, of course, the situation of Tubos Reunidos at that time was already really worrying because in 2026, it filed for voluntary bankruptcy due to imminent insolvency. And until then, the banks ended up selling its debt at losses of up to 90%. Of course, there was a viability plan that you also took into consideration to approve the bailout. In light of all this, do you think the viability plan that you approved was realistic? And I'm not saying that you were responsible for the viability plan. What I mean is that there was a clearly difficult situation in the company's finances, which moreover was confirmed just a few years later. Were you aware of it?
What I think we're all aware of here is that when we talk about the fund, we're talking about companies that were having difficulties and that needed, as a last resort, help because of those difficulties.
But it's due to COVID, not their previous activity, correct? Because of COVID.
Of course, related to COVID, and they had to prove that they were viable before and that COVID was the cause, right? Therefore, I insist, I am completely unaware of this information you are giving me. And all the information that was presented to the Management Council met that criterion, which was precisely that this difficult situation was a consequence of COVID.
Now, I suppose that the person who replaces you on the Management Council, which no longer grants aid but is in the monitoring phase, is your successor, Mr. Joan Grisar.
That's right, correct.
It's just that during the monitoring phase of Tubos Reunidos, we have found, well, the courts have found and the Civil Guard has found another scheme, which is the famous waiver of the 10 million that Tubos Reunidos was required to return to deliver according to the financing contract itself and the guarantee they were required to deliver it for the payment of the bailout. And yet it was released. And released from that obligation by the Council of the Monitoring Committee, and I suppose with the knowledge of Joan Grisar, who is your successor.
I have no knowledge of what you just told me. Well,
this is information that is published. A new legal case has also been initiated for this reason. 10 million, just imagine. Tubos Reunidos owes 112 million, sells a property in the 6th for 15 million, and asks SEPI to authorize them not to pay 10 million. And he gets it because Vicente Fernandez allegedly receives a 200,000 euro bribe for arranging something at SEPI. The problem is that at SEPI, the management board is still made up of the same members, including Joan Grisar. I don't know if Joan Grisar was aware of or is aware of the decisions made by the monitoring committee, but in principle he should be, since the management board is still the main body, fundamental.
I can't answer whether the current Secretary of State was aware or not.
You haven't mentioned this to Joan Grisar?
No, of course not.
No, of course not.
I'm not sure if he knows either.
All right. Well, I'm going to wrap up now because I think my time is up. Just one last question.
Yes, you don't mind. Last question, please.
Look, ma'am, Ms. Aagesen, it turns out that all the initial members of the Management Council, almost all of them, I think, have received significant appointments in very well-paid positions. National Heritage, Renfe, and forgive me, there's no ill intent behind the question. Do you feel you earned your stripes as Vice President and Minister through your work on the Management Council?
Of course not. And you're talking about higher pay. You know that a Secretary of State has a higher salary than a minister and a vice president.
Not the President of National Heritage or the President of Renfe, no, I can tell you that.
Well, I want you to know that in my previous position, the salary was much higher than in this case. So can you answer the question? I want you to know that. No, I wasn't handed those roles, and I continue working with the utmost technical rigor and for the public interest, I assure you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Thank you, Mr. Hernando. Now it's Mrs. Gomez's turn. Go ahead, Mrs. Gomez.
Thank you, Madam President. Good morning, everyone. Mrs. Aagesen, welcome to this Senate Investigative Committee. Today, you are here to answer for the management of public funds, and I am going to focus on the company Tubos Reunidos, an alleged arbitrary and fraudulent use of funds belonging to all Spaniards under the shadow of political influence, partisan pressure, and kickbacks. Let's set the scene, Ms. Aagesen. Your actions go back to 2021. At that time, you were Secretary of State for Energy under Teresa Rivera and a member of the SEPI Management Board. In other words, you were the final filter, the last check before sending the Tubos Reunidos bailout to the Council of Ministers. Mr. Raul Blanco also sat on that same SEPI Management Board with you. Let's remember that he was then the Secretary General of Industry, later rewarded at Renfe, and today implicated in the hydrocarbons case. Your role and Mr. Blanco's role was decisive, and it was to be the key that would open the door to those 112.8 million euros in rescue funds. Money that ended up being granted after the rigging of a socialist scheme, a scheme led by the then Secretary of Organization of the PSOE, Mr. Santos Cerdán. Cerdán, Vicente Fernández, Leire Díez, Anchón, Alonso, and Espoleada in the Tubos Reunidos case because of the suffocating pressure, the PMV partner of Pedro Sánchez. For this hearing, Madam Minister, I have relied and will rely on the UCO reports. These reports are not speculative, but rather they provide a lot of information and also a lot of evidence. The report on this case outlines a business leadership that knew exactly which political strings to pull. Strings that began to be pulled on September 18, 2020, when Tubos Reunidos asked for information about the rescue fund. Just 2 days later, he had meetings. He asked for information about the rescue fund. Just 2 days later, SEPI's Vicente Fernandez was already maneuvering with the company. And I ask you, do you think Vicente Fernandez was the shadow president of SEPI?
I don't know this man, nor do I believe anything, since I wasn't aware of his existence.
The shadow Vicente. So you were part of the SEPI management board, and you didn't know who the former president of SEPI, Vicente Fernandez, was.
When I joined the management board, that man was no longer part of SEPI.
He wasn't part of it, but people were still talking about him at SEPI.
In my case, I was never aware of him, never spoke to him, and was never part of any conversation about this man you mentioned.
You don't know him? No. Have you ever spoken with him?
No.
Okay. On November 20th, 2020, he was in a meeting formalizing the request, and just 3 days later, the company's executives, Irasusta and Perez Urrutia, were already dividing up the calls to pressure SEPI due to their delicate treasury situation. Urrutia was contacting high-ranking officials of the organization, while Irasusta maintained a direct channel with the Irurok group, that socialist network involving the company Fernandez Lere and Anchon Alonso, all of them, I repeat, under the umbrella of Santos Cerdan. Let's move to February 1st, 2021. The shamelessness of those involved was recorded in a WhatsApp message from Urrutia to Irasusta, and it said, "When it's our turn, you and I will control this with Vicente and Miguel Angel." For our board, it's better to leave this aside. Did you know who Miguel Angel was in this message? Who was Miguel Angel? Did you know?
No, I don't know them either.
You didn't know Miguel Angel was SEPI's mole?
No, of course not.
And you don't know Miguel Angel Figueroa?
Honestly, right now I can't even place him.
You don't know who Miguel Angel Figueroa is?
I insist. I'm telling you no. And I'm telling you that you're talking about a story that's completely unrelated to my role.
With this, I want to tell you, Mrs. Angel, that now the company's executives, as well as those involved in the socialist scheme, can clearly see what they were doing. They were controlling the case file from outside the legal channels. Spring of 2021 arrived, and the company's financial situation was practically hopeless. It was disastrous, on the verge of bankruptcy. The technical processing at SEPI got stuck, and Mr. Vicente Fernandez himself admitted that the company would have no chance unless help arrived, help from the very top. What did Mr. Vicente Fernandez mean by help from the very top?
I don't know.
You are a minister, right? You belong to Sanchez's government. Thank you.
Stop.
I'm not going to make any comments about something I know nothing about. I don't even know the people who mentioned that from the very top.
Who is above you, over you?
I don't have anyone above me, as you can see. There's nothing above me but air, as you can see.
No, don't go off on a tangent. You are a minister, you are part of a government. Who is above you in the government?
In the government, as you know, there is the Prime Minister, ministers, vice presidents, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Ms. Angel, they raised the alarm within the scheme. The SEPI Management Board, the Undersecretary of Finance, Pilar Paneque, revealed that you firmly refused to bail out Tubos Reunidos for ecological and environmental reasons. What were those ecological and environmental reasons that you based your decision on? It was based on the fact that that bailout could not be granted to Tubos Reunidos.
As I mentioned before, I was not present at that meeting. As I said, it was an informational meeting.
No, informal. No, it's a meeting. I'm asking you about the technical reports you relied on to reject the bailout for Tubos Reunidos for ecological and environmental reasons. There's no mention of a meeting.
There is no technical report where my TECO, as I told you, said that it was against Tubos Reunidos.
This information that we have on the table from the UKO reports, what is it based on?
Excuse me, you are talking about a UKO report? By the way, I have the utmost respect for the Civil Guard, but it talks about conversations between two people who in turn have another conversation with someone else. I repeat, from the Ministry for the Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge, we did not issue a report against the operation, in this case in support of Tubos Reunidos for ecological reasons. What we always did, our motivation was always to ensure that all the operations that reached the management board made progress in the ecological transition.
So what did you base your decision on to reject the bailout?
But I'm going back to the same point. First, it's not a bailout. And second, there was no rejection. Therefore, you're denying the main point.
There was no rejection. So why did you have to pressure the network to get it unlocked?
Well, I'll tell you the same thing again.
I don't know about that. Supposedly you did or said something, but through a report or through, I delegated to someone. I didn't delegate, nor...
I didn't delegate to anyone because...
Ma'am, that's the information we have. We're not making anything up here. It's one thing if you want to acknowledge it and another if you don't want to acknowledge it. But that's the information we have, and we didn't just make it up. It's another thing if you don't want to acknowledge it, just say you don't know, but don't make a mess here. Don't complicate things when the reality is different.
Excuse me, I'm not complicating anything. I'm answering with what I know, just as I answered your colleague earlier in this session. I'm telling you that I couldn't attend the initial deliberations in that session because, as I said, I was dealing with an extremely complicated situation. And did I transmit anything? Did I delegate?
To someone?
No, I didn't delegate. I'm telling you, nothing. I didn't delegate. I didn't delegate at that informative management council meeting. I didn't have time to delegate anything at all. So,
what is this information based on?
I don't know what it's based on. Ask the people who are mentioned there. I'm telling you, and I insist, I'm not going to make any judgments about the opinions of third parties regarding a scheme I wasn't even aware existed, as I have already told you before.
So, rephrasing the question in another way, because I'm not convinced by your explanation. What specific technical reports, what environmental data were available that led to the decision that it was not suitable to receive the bailout?
But I'm coming back to the same point.
It was polluting, right? It wasn't a polluting company.
I'll say the same thing again. There was no negative report regarding the support for Tubos Reunidos from the Ministry for Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge. It was, as I mentioned before, a collective effort where we analyzed the information sent regarding what the transition plans were. Ecological, in this case, a company like Tubos Reunidos, as you know and have mentioned. We're talking about the steelworks, we're talking about steel, which is energy intensive, where they presented their report on actions and measures to contribute to that ecological transition. In which field? In the energy field and in the environmental field. And that's what they did. They presented it. They presented measures to reduce their consumption, to increase their efficiency.
According to your experience, Ms. Aagesen, is this company polluting or not?
It is. It is a company that releases emissions into the atmosphere. But it is...
Is it polluting?
Well, like so many others, but it is committed to reducing emissions. In fact, it is already reducing them.
Well, it's already dead. Well,
but what I want to tell you is...
Let me go back.
I'll explain again. We rely on the information provided, in this case, the ecological transition plan or the measures presented by the companies.
At the time of the bailout, was this company polluting or not polluting? Bailout.
Sorry, it's just that all the companies... No.
Yes or no?
What does polluting mean to you? No.
No, what does it mean to you as the expert?
Well, if you want me to tell you what my assessment was.
Was it polluting or was it not polluting?
It emitted greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And what we valued was making sure they had measures in place to reduce those emissions in the future. And that's what they presented.
Which year are you talking about?
They were committed to total decarbonization, aligned with all of that.
For which year? I don't remember exactly. How much time does a company need to reach those goals?
Well, the goal set at the United Nations level, the goal set at the European level, is climate neutrality by 2050.
By 2050, I mean, you received a...
You received a bailout?
Being a polluter because you promised that by 2050 you would no longer be a polluter.
No, I think you're twisting the information. What I'm telling you is that it was going to reduce consumption through energy efficiency. It was going to switch to more renewable fuels. It's a company that was going to support the circular economy by using recycled steel.
One thing is that it's going to do it, and another thing is actually doing it. I'm talking about the moment of the bailout. At the time of the bailout, it was a polluting company.
The important thing is, that's why it's your report. And all the airlines and all the industrial companies, absolutely all the companies, what they have to do is guarantee that they are going to work to reduce their carbon footprint. They are going to work to reduce their energy consumption. They are going to work to support the circular economy.
Was the pollution one of the reasons why the bailout was blocked?
I'm telling you there was no block, and you keep using the word bailout. I would like to refer to it again as a support system.
For a company. We know it's a loan, but so people understand us, because a lot of people are watching us from outside, we talk about a bailout. We know what a bailout is. We know it perfectly well.
I'm sorry, but I want to clarify just to simplify. Okay.
When he found out about the veto, Vicente Fernandez admitted to his partner, "I have given this man lunch."
Excuse me, when you talk about the veto, I'll say it again. I wasn't at the briefing, so there was no veto. And besides, it was just a briefing, so there was no reason for any veto. So you're asking me to take a position on a meeting I wasn't at, where I did not exercise any veto at all, and a conversation involving people I don't even know. Therefore, I want to make that clear.
And if you weren't there, who was there in your place?
That day, I repeat, no one from the Ministry for Ecological Transition attended.
But there was a day when someone did show up, right?
They attended the final decision. Present was the Undersecretary of the Ministry, representing the Ministry for Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge.
What's it called?
His name is Miguel González Suela. He's the Undersecretary.
I'll talk about him later. Did you delegate to him?
I delegated to him, yes. Okay.
I'll continue. When they found out about the veto, and I say veto because the reports we have, Mrs. Aagesen mention a veto, and I'm referring to the reports. I'm not going to make anything up.
I'm not sure which reports you mean. Excuse me.
All this information comes from the UCO reports, from the ongoing investigations. I don't know if you read the news, if you don't read the news.
I read the news and
I go back to whether you read the reports. We prepare for this commission that way because it's the only information we have available to us.
well, I can tell you that I didn't express any veto because I wasn't at the meeting.
All right, I'll continue. Vicente Fernandez admitted his partners. I gave lunch to this man, president of Tubos, Reunidos, Irasusta, and he warned that the rescue fund was going to be closed. Irasusta had an emergency meeting with the president of SEPI, Belen Gualda, and she just asked him for more time. They were on the ropes. Why did the scheme, after environmental rejection, use the portable route to activate the machinery?
I'll insist again. You said that I was against it.
I know you won't admit it. I know you won't admit it because doing so would get you in trouble. That's why you won't.
How am I going to admit to something that isn't true? I'm telling you I wasn't at a meeting, so I couldn't have said anything.
About one. No, I'm not specifically referring to that meeting you weren't at. I'm referring to the moment when it was given the green light. You met with the polluting company and you delegated your vote to your colleague.
Excuse me, I just wanted to say, look, the great Angel, forgive me if you'll allow me. No.
Sir, you don't always go to the meeting where you didn't go. No.
No, I'm going to the meeting you missed. You're telling me.
The shield is always there.
I'm not looking for cover, I assure you. What I can tell you is that the Management Council adhered to the 13 criteria that you know perfectly well. And you know it. There are 13 criteria, and therefore I don't understand the obsession with talking about a veto that never existed.
Why do you think that in order to achieve the goal of rescuing the company, since it wasn't possible through that way, the political route was used and activated?
I don't know. No, I don't know the scheme or the people you are mentioning.
I can't believe that you're working inside an organization and you really don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I don't believe it.
Therefore,
You are not doing your job.
how am I supposed to know anything if it's not being monitored for risk?
Aren't you monitoring the risks?
Excuse me, you know perfectly well that no, it's not about goals. And I go back to talking about the Court of Auditors. I'm going to talk about the European Commission, the General Court of Justice of the European Union, where it confirms that the work, the procedures, all the information submitted to the Management Board met those requirements. And that's the information we used. If you ask me whether we detected any practice, no.
It's very curious, Ms. Angel, that I've been following the SEPI Commission, and here I've seen people from different political positions come through. And they all say they don't know anything, they all dodge the questions. None of them were in those meetings, nobody knew anyone, nobody knows anything about anyone, they don't know who PS is. They don't know what Aero Europa is, they don't know who Mr. Zapatero is, nobody knows anything. So I'm already used to this story. But this story is the one you want to give us. It's not the real one. My job here is to find out what happened at that moment. And I'm focusing on Tubos Reunidos, where your name comes up. And that's why you're sitting here today, because your name comes up. And your name comes up linking you to your veto, which you don't want to call a veto, but there was a veto. And that veto was environmental and ecological. And that's the information we have on the table. No, we're not making anything up.
Ma'am, if I may, I'll repeat, there was no veto. And secondly, you're asking me if that company was polluting when it operated as a steel industry, which, as you well know, is energy intensive. But the management board had to oversee how it would move forward in that ecological transition, both in terms of energy and the environment. And for that, the company was asked to present an action plan with specific measures. And in this case, they did. They did. They presented actions and specific measures, but it wasn't analyzed whether the company, like you, excuse me if I may, can't analyze. What can't happen is that you tell me that just because Tubos Reunidos was polluting, they were polluting, and so they couldn't be given help. What is clear is that what was being asked was for them to tell us how, in the future, they were going to contribute to that reduction in emissions. They were going to contribute to recycling, they were going to use materials, they were going to contribute to that ecological transition. And that's exactly what the company did. They had meetings, they presented a plan and a report.
He presented the plan 21 days later.
I insist.
The way was cleared.
But you know, it's not just because of that. You know that
it's not just based on that fact. He was in a meeting. Besides, he didn't meet other legal requirements. It wasn't just that one.
I'll go back to him.
It wasn't just that one.
It's not just that one, there's more.
That's one that I'm addressing. From now on, I'll address the rest. So please let me continue because my time is also limited. On July 3rd, Vicente Fernandez went even further. He sought help from the PNV itself, from Mr. Urtusa. The network knew that the PNV had enough political power to put pressure at the very top. And by the very top, Ms. Sangense, I mean Pedro Sánchez. And that way, to be able to unlock the money. Here, Ms. Angense, the UCO detected back and forth calls between high-ranking officials of the PNV, the Basque government, and also the Ministry of Finance, which at that time was headed by your colleague Maria Jesus Montero. The objective was more than clear: to pressure in order to sway your judgment. The most serious thing of all, Ms. Angense, is that the messages from the intermediaries were based on personal greed. They said, if we contribute, to make sure the operation goes through and doesn't fall apart. What we want is to get some kind of compensation for our involvement. Do you think that's normal?
Of course, I don't think that's normal. Zero tolerance for corruption, I assure you.
Thank you. On July 9th, the environmental objections vanished as if by magic. After the intervention of the PNV, a key partner in Pedro Sánchez's investiture and of Moncloa itself, Vicente Fernandez sends the network the signal of victory. Belén, Belengualda. The president of SEPI had been summoned to Moncloa to receive the order to unblock. Were you at that meeting? Did you know about this meeting?
I didn't know about the meeting, so I couldn't have been there.
What person, political official or intermediary contacted you directly or through your office to make you change your mind?
I'll say it again, there was no change of mind.
On July 13th, Ms. Jesse, that pressure had an effect. Just 3 weeks after your firm blockade, you radically changed your vote by supporting the bailout in SEPI, and the management board approved the aid of 112.8 million euros. Did you maintain your environmental stance back then?
I insist. You are describing something that I am telling you did not happen. The ministry's vision was always to ensure that companies made commitments, made progress, and put forward measures in favor of the ecological transition in all its dimensions. And that's what the company did. And therefore, I repeat, what's important is meeting the 13 criteria, but we, the different departments of the ministry, recognized that the company was making an effort to advance the ecological transition. Therefore, I repeat that I was never pressured, not in this case or in any other case, and it is not true at all that the ministry changed its mind. The ministry's position was always to ensure that all of them made progress, guided and implemented measures, plans, and actions for the ecological transition.
What call from Moncloa made your unyielding ecological stance disappear in just 21 days? Why did everything change in just 21 days and then they presented it all? Suddenly, in 21 days, the company was no longer polluting.
It was something amazing. I think you're explaining it in a way that doesn't match reality. No. It's just that the company, obviously a steel and pipe manufacturing company in this case, was clearly polluting. The important thing was to say that the company had an action plan to gradually reduce its pollutant load, to also reduce its consumption of raw materials, and in this case, to embrace recycling and the circular economy. And that's what they presented. So I insist, it's not a change of opinion. It's an opinion that is formed based on the information provided by the company itself.
All right. Well, I'm going to keep insisting that it is a change of opinion and that it cost the Spanish people 112.8 million euros of public money just to save a company that is now in bankruptcy proceedings. If time and the current bankruptcy of the company have proven that veto was right, even if it wasn't yours, there was an initial ecological veto. Do you admit that giving in to political pressure resulted in €1 million waste that could have been foreseen?
I completely disagree. I didn't receive any political pressure in this case or in any other case.
Who do you think will now be held responsible for investing millions in a company that was unviable and environmentally incompatible?
Of course, if there is an ongoing procedure, in this case, I have the utmost respect for justice and judicial proceedings.
The company was the same before the bailout, during the bailout, and now? That is, the activity is the same, it is carried out in the same way, and environmentally, it remains the same.
Who ordered you?
Who ordered González Suela to prepare a new report?
What do you mean, a new report? There isn't a new report.
At the second meeting, wasn't approval already given with the report?
Let me reiterate, what is done in the ministry is to analyze how the different departments are progressing in that transition. I've already told you, it's a working report to review all the information that was coming in. It's a working document. You can call it whatever you want. But of course, what really mattered was meeting the 13 eligibility criteria. Who
ordered González Suela to prepare that working document? Call it whatever you want. I call it a report. Who ordered him to do it?
But no, there's absolutely nothing that needs to be ordered. Yes.
Because of course you delegated it to him, didn't you?
Well, I told you again, this was a job that was done collectively in the ministry. Of course. Did you delegate to him? What about you?
Did you delegate to him in that meeting where the green light was given to the rescue?
That you talked to him, sorry. No, did you delegate to him? I delegated to him, of course.
Why did you delegate to him? Why?
Because I couldn't be there. We were in the middle of a crisis, the first big energy crisis in this country. And therefore, I had the utmost trust in a person who represented the entire Ministry for Ecological Transition, where what mattered were the functions of the management board. And I repeat once again, it's about complying with the established criteria. And that's what the Court of Auditors has endorsed. The management board submitted reports to us that supported those criteria, and therefore our decision was favorable.
So the report prepared by Mr. González Sola and presented at that second meeting, which gave the green light for the rescue of Tubos Reunidos, was prepared by a group of people, according to the ministry, by him.
Del ministerio, por supuesto.
Didn't you review it?
There was an energy transition component, there was a circular economy component, there was a component about what the trends are. Okay, but did you review it before? I know the report.
You know it and you find it appropriate?
Of course.
Okay. Finally, on July 20th, the Council of Ministers ratified the aid, and parallel to the bailout, the scheme began to collect its loot, its kickbacks. And I ask you, did you know that at first the company used for these kickbacks was the mediation company Mediaciones Martínez, which received a total of 114,954 euros, 114,954 euros from Tubos Reunidos under a simulated business development concept?
No, I'm not aware.
You don't know anything?
No.
You probably also don't know that in November 2023, the scheme formalized a new contract listing Vicente Fernandez as a private individual. He ended up receiving 25,000 euros directly into his bank account, a payment that was allegedly a thank you for having secured the public bailout.
Neither.
Look at where the consequences of that report led, which was ultimately validated in that second meeting, to a scheme's kickbacks.
I just don't agree with how you're linking those things. That working document is it had nothing to do with it. No, it's not related because the evaluation of the 13 criteria didn't require that report.
Justice, when justice takes its course, we'll see who will be proven right, okay?
Of course, the utmost respect for justice.
Additionally, through a fictitious consulting contract, he issued or had issued 12 monthly invoices to Tubos Reunidos, through which he received another 60,000 euros. Also, of course, there was the bonus for influence peddling with the PNV, where Vicente Fernandez and Lere Diaz agreed on an extraordinary and additional payment of 40,000 euros. Were you aware that while they were changing that report or making a new report so the company would meet environmental requirements and not pollute in record time, in 21 days? Don't forget it. The intermediaries in the scheme were already profiting from this.
Of course not.
How can we refer to that change of opinion or that new report in this context?
I'll say it again. You talk about the new report as if there were an old report. No, I deny it. I deny the premise.
No. You said that in the second meeting, what was discussed was for the company to adapt.
No, I didn't say that the second meeting was about that. What the second meeting did...
Forgive me and excuse my ignorance on the subject, but I use logic and common sense. If a company asks for a bailout and you tell it it has to comply with environmental measures, it means they weren't following them in the first place. What do you base your claim that they weren't complying with those measures on? On the documentation the company provides you. Nothing more, nothing less.
It's just that at no point have I
said they weren't complying, so you assess the situation.
You're saying it's like a report claiming they weren't complying, that I attended a meeting and said so, and then a third person disagreed.
No, don't make things up. Don't make up things I haven't said. I haven't said that you went to a meeting. No, I said that if that company was going... Eva, to get a bailout of 112.8 million and you told them they had to adapt to environmental measures, it means that at that moment they weren't complying. It's that simple.
But what you said wasn't told to them, and it's just common sense from the beginning. But they weren't told that they weren't complying, nor that they were complying, that they should comply.
That in that report or in that work that you carry out...
But I repeat, all the companies presented measures to support the ecological transition. All of them. Absolutely all of them.
At that second meeting, when you gave Tubos Reunidos the green light, it was considered compliant because it was supposedly going to adapt over time.
But I go back to the same point. You say they weren't complying before and then they were.
But you're contradicting yourself.
No, I'm not contradicting myself. You're saying there was a report and a previous assessment. No, what I'm telling you is that...
Un momento.
In the information, well, that's it.
That's what I'm saying. Whether there's a report or not, Ms. Aagesen, if you have information, that's it.
But I go back to the same thing. All the companies, absolutely all the companies that came to ask SEPI for help through the Solvency Fund, as you can see in the criteria, and I understand that you have looked at them, they had to present actions and measures to advance the ecological transition. Absolutely all of them. Of course, all of them.
So was there a report?
No, let's see. The companies would either issue a report or a memo about measures and so on.
But they had a report, didn't they?
But from the companies presented the measures, of course. And there yes.
And there you based it on whether they met the requirements or not?
No. The requirements, as you also know, were evaluated by reports from SEPI's independent entities. Always SEPI. always independent organizations.
You didn't, when an independent report landed on your desk, you didn't review that report, right?
You validated it, yes.
Which one is it?
I'm going back to the same thing, and they processed it. The reports, until the decision was made, they were taking shape. There were debates in the briefing sessions, and obviously the final reports were the ones that confirmed that those criteria were being met.
How strange. How strange that in the end it was Vicente Fernandez, the shadow president of SEPI, who activated the political machinery for this company to be rescued. That's the summary, Ms. Aagesen.
It's just that you're talking about someone I don't even know.
You don't know her. Well, you'll get to know her. At least you've probably seen her on TV at some point, I suppose. Entonces, so, I'm going to tell you why he was in that meeting. He didn't meet the requirements. He was in that meeting. He ended up in bankruptcy due to insolvency, and he implemented a layoff plan that destroyed the jobs that both you and the PNV supposedly came here to protect. For the rescue from the support fund for the solvency of strategic companies managed by SEPI and the companies, they had to meet strict legal requirements set by Royal Decree Law 25/2020. According to the UCO report, the internal documentation exchanged within the SEPI Management Board showed that Tubos Reunidos did not meet the requirements to be rescued. Environmental incompatibility and lack of a decarbonization plan, something you oversee and understand perfectly, was the reason why you issued an adverse opinion and initially vetoed the aid. The company's steel-making activity was in direct conflict with your government's energy transition guidelines. The money from the fund could not finance highly polluting industries without a specific green viability plan, which the company did not have at that time. It's true that they didn't have it at that time.
That's not true.
Did they have it?
A transition report was submitted. Ecological transition. An ecological transition report was submitted. Yes, a transition report was submitted.
Can you send it to this committee?
All information, as I have also told your colleague in this session, is safeguarded by SEPI. If you want to request information, you can request it from SEPI.
Madam President, if you see it appropriate, I would like you to request access to this report.
No.
We will take note of it.
Thank you.
Another concern was the high risk of structural insolvency and uncertain future viability. The regulations of the European Union and SEPI required that the company's crisis be strictly temporary, meaning caused by the pandemic, and that the company demonstrate long-term viability after the financial injection. However, the top management had a history of poor management, with a predominantly financial focus over industrial matters. The major banks sold Tubos Reunidos' debt to a vulture fund, with losses of up to 90%. Just a few months after receiving the aid, because they already considered the company to be unviable and that it could never pay the money back. How much bailout money has been repaid so far? Tubos Reunidos, Ms. Aagesen?
As far as Mr. Aagesen has said, almost 12 million in interest has been paid, but the original amount hasn't been returned. But honestly, I don't have the traceability right now.
Well, I'm telling you that Tubos Reunidos has a total debt of 263 million, of which 150 million are owed to SEPI. The principal amount is 112.8, and the rest is accrued and unpaid interest. Another problem was no guarantee of public funds being returned. The solvency analysis required the company to present a solid economic scenario to ensure that the bailout would be repaid. The UCO focuses on the fact that SEPI arbitrarily relaxed and altered these financial solvency controls, ignoring that the weakness of the cash flow threatened to lead to uncollectible debt. Do you know if the LERE scheme allegedly intervened with SEPI to get the company's mandatory repayment of 10 million euros postponed?
I don't know. I think you asked me the same question before in your previous intervention, or...
Do you know who from SEPI would be willing and advocated for this delay?
I have no idea at all, and if I had detected any irregularity, I would have reported it, I assure you.
I can also talk about the use of the Ordinary Treasury Emergency Fund. In the messages intercepted by the UCO, the executives themselves admitted that the request for the bailout was stuck and that they needed to put pressure to activate exceptional emergency mechanisms, claiming a delicate cash flow situation. The phase fund was intended for post-pandemic structural solvency and not to act as a lifeline to cover operational debt and supplier payment pressures. Since the bailout required by law a strict viability plan, and you, as a member of the SEPI Management Board, how do you explain that the company which received more than 112.8 million collapsed into insolvency, shortly after leaving a hole of 150 in the public coffers?
I insist, as you also know, and since you are reading all the information you have, I would also like to inform you of what the Court of Auditors says. The Court of Auditors says, regarding the checks carried out on all the files processed by the fund, it is concluded that in granting the phase aid, the management and decision-making bodies applied a procedure appropriate to the purposes set out in its regulatory standard. They had the necessary information to make decisions, which were properly justified, and they acted in a non-discriminatory manner, in accordance with the previously established procedural rules.
But that's not the answer to this question.
It is the answer. What we did was, in view of all the reports that were submitted to the Management Council by the different institutions, both external and internal to SEPI, we made the decisions based on the information provided.
So everything was in order?
Excuse me?
Everything was in order?
Everything was in order. Yes, everything was in order.
Perfect.
I insist. The information that reached the Management Council stated that everything was in order. Yes.
Yes. Did your department in any way monitor how those funds were used and overseen? Or did you just sign the transfer to avoid a possible shutdown, a political crisis with your PNV partners?
I insist there was no pressure from anyone when making decisions in the Management Council.
What was the PNV's role here, Ms. Kese? What do you think the PNV was doing in all this?
Please don't ask me that question. It's not about who has a role and who doesn't.
As you know, in a bailout, the autonomous communities of the SEPI with a private company.
But I'm coming back to the same thing. You must have seen, and I hope you have looked at it, you must have seen that we are not talking about the Basque country. We talk about Murcia, we talk about Madrid, we talk about Andalusia, we talk about companies that are present in the regions and therefore the regions are interested. Jobs, more than 60,000 of them, because you are talking about schemes and a lot of things. But I would also like to highlight that we are talking about an extraordinarily complex context, where what was done was to help preserve more than 60,000 jobs and this country's economic and business base. And the information, I insist, aside from all the corruption part, zero tolerance, I repeat it over and over, but the decisions were precisely to preserve our country's productive and industrial base at an extraordinarily difficult time.
In the end, you should know it isn't done.
Well, 60,000 jobs, I don't know if you think that's little. Maybe no one in your family is involved in these 60,000 jobs that have been preserved, but all the families who have kept their jobs thanks to this aid, I really want to highlight that.
And finally, to finish, Madam President, Ms. Arces, do you assume any political responsibility for having delegated a vote through an operation that the Civil Guard today describes as an alleged fraud involving suspected kickbacks?
No, I have a very clear conscience. I have worked with the utmost technical rigor and by following the procedures clearly established in this Management Council. Therefore, I believe that justice is already doing its job and will go all the way to the end. And I am convinced that in another setting, not in the Management Council, it will continue its work and determine responsibilities in this regard.
Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gomez. Ms. Payares has the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam Minister, I truly appreciate your presence here in this committee, especially the tone you are using. I'm not going to talk about attitude because that word defines other people who are not at their best right now. But I do want to acknowledge the patience you have shown in the face of some of the questions and accusations being made against you in this hearing, which is basically a trial, with predetermined verdicts already. And I regret that because people really need answers. Because in this judicialized context, all the reports, people here aren't lying, They say what they read. They say what is set out in the reports that have come out. And therefore, obviously, they are concerning. They concern us as legislators, but clearly the public is fed up. They are fed up with having this situation. A context of corruption, as you yourself have said, and from Junts per Catalunya, we support a zero-tolerance stance on corruption because we are public officials and we are at the service of the public. This disappoints citizens who are seeing the impact of taxes, that many can't even open their businesses or families are in a really bad situation just to make it to the end of the month, right? But here the saying, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, doesn't work. Here everyone throws stones to see who they hit and who they can hurt. And this doesn't help. It doesn't help a country that is now starting a budget process and we'll see how it ends, and therefore it doesn't guarantee stability. This is not the country where we constantly see an increase in insecurity. In the streets, in Catalonia, we do have a budget, but we have teachers out in the streets. Now we'll let you breathe, but in September, this continues. We have doctors out in the streets. We have infrastructure that we don't deserve.
Shall we continue?
Yes, it's just that, no.
It can't be related to SEPI.
Yes, of course. Now I'm going to continue. Please.
I ask you, Ms. Payares, to focus on the Commission's purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, but I'm going to tie this in with what I'm going to say next. But I have to say it because the context that is being created is leading to a situation that I think is out of the ordinary. Regarding the public's perception, our work, and obviously the work of a government that has to look after the interests. And that's where I'm going. For us, and as I have already said, no matter where the accusations come from, for Junts per Catalunya, we demand and will continue to demand transparency and accountability in this format or in any other. Maybe this one, in my opinion, is not the most appropriate, but you are here and you are giving answers, right? Because this commission is not only about specific cases of corruption, but also, in our view, raises serious doubts about the centralized management of state resources, in this case, through SEPI or the solvency support funds. For us, the important thing is, first and foremost, the defense of the interest of Catalonia. And some of the operations being discussed today, for example, Tubos, Reunidos, in our view, political criteria and partisan influences were prioritized over real viability or strategic impact. As we have seen in this case, it's a company in bankruptcy proceedings. Catalonia also has a strong steel industrial sector and in energy as well. Right now, for example, there is a case happening in a specific company due to decarbonization issues in the Dow, which also has many jobs at stake. And 80 million are needed to carry out this operation in its crater. For example, to give examples similar to what is happening to us in Catalonia. As I said, as I'm telling you, we also criticize the current SEPI model because, in our opinion, it has worked. Like a placement agency and a tool for patronage. From what has been coming to light, with questionable contracts and, in our opinion, a lack of oversight. And this, without a doubt, erodes trust in Spanish state institutions and reinforces the need that, as Junts per Catalunya, we have been saying for months, more self-government for Catalonia, especially with the economic agreement and the issue of funding for the autonomous communities. Therefore, for us, this context highlights this lack of awareness regarding resources for Catalonia. And of course, we will remain consistent. We are not pointing fingers at anyone. We point out the corruption and we point out the disappointment of these systematic cases at the level of the Spanish state. And of course, we don't want any irregularity to be covered up in Parliament, not in court or anywhere else. We must answer before the courts and we must clarify these terms. But what is true, and it has been mentioned here, is that you were part of the board, of course, that approved the rescue. You were part of the management board that approved the rescue of Tubos Reunidos. And in that scheme, as far as we know, you have denied it here. Initially, you opposed it for environmental reasons in a meeting that we were not part of, the one you have denied. Initially, you opposed it, for environmental reasons. in a meeting that took place on June 15, 2021. And then the scheme then applied pressure higher up so that these aid packages could be granted, right? I'm not going to argue or ask you about it. You've already said what you had to say, but just so you know, this is documented in some reports, and that's why we also refer to them. But anyway, I am going to ask you, what was your exact role as Secretary of State for Energy and as a member of this council in the different bailouts involving Europa Plus Ultra and Tubos Reunidos? And you have also talked here about the technical reports. I was going to ask you what technical reports there should have been and what feasibility assessments needed to be done. I think you have already answered this in some way. But I am interested in why some companies were prioritized, for example, Tubos Reunidos over others with earlier requests. Some of them might have affected Catalonia. And the question is more about whether you strictly followed the criteria of a viable company affected by royal decree on COVID 2520. And just a couple of questions that affect Catalonia, which really concerns us. What impact have these bailouts had on the industrial fabric? What about Catalonia? Because some of them are aligned with electro-intensive companies, and now with an energy model, as you know, that is in place. Well, under pressure because of the ecological transition, but they require significant investments in order to comply with what is needed for this ecological transition. We wonder if there were or if there continue to be discriminatory practices or a lack of opportunity. Similar opportunities for Catalan companies in sectors that are strategic today. As I mentioned, I gave the example of Dow in Tarragona, but I could name other companies. And to finish, how does your ministry plan to ensure that state funds, in which you obviously may have a role, do not perpetuate territorial imbalances, especially with the fiscal deficit of Catalonia? Thank you very much, Madam Minister, for being here, for answering what you can, because obviously many of the things we are talking about are under seal, right? Therefore, I want to thank you for your demeanor before this committee. And obviously, from Junts per Catalunya, we are concerned about this context, and we will continue to be present in these committees as long as we can. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Palares. Regarding the more specific questions you asked, I will begin. You're discussing the order of precedence and why one was entered first. The information I have as a member of the management board is that the order of precedence was determined by when the files arrived at the SEPI office and by their level of readiness. This is the information we, the management board, had. And it is information that we understand, and I understand it this way as a member of this board, that is supported by the Court of Auditors when it clearly states that there was no discriminatory treatment, neither favorable nor unfavorable. I think this is important, and I want to emphasize it. Regarding the fulfillment of a fundamental criterion, which is that the company's economic impact was decisive, COVID was obviously one of the criteria that had to be evaluated. And those criteria were included in all the reports that were submitted to the management board. In fact, obviously, as you know, and as I have explained to you, in this commission, out of 74 cases, 34, let's say, did not even reach completion or become part of the management board's deliberations, precisely. Because either they didn't find the conditions imposed to be interesting, or because it was clear that these were companies that were not viable. Therefore, there is a significant group of companies, 34 out of a total of 74, that didn't even make it there. Of the rest, the 20 that received, let's say, a favorable resolution, those 20 strictly met, and that's how it was reported to us, the members of the Management Council, all 13 eligibility criteria. I think this is very important, and I want to highlight it again regarding the issue of competitiveness, which is so significant. Speaking of the energy transition, to which I have devoted a large part of my professional life, I believe that the energy transition itself is giving an extraordinary window of opportunity to the entire industry. The Catalan industry, of course, and industry across the rest of the country, because what we have seen is that depending on external energy sources such as fossil fuels makes us very vulnerable. Actually, they bring us a lot of volatility. Therefore, this government's commitment will continue to be to boost the competitiveness of Catalonia's industrial sector, to ensure all opportunities reach it, and obviously opportunities without limits. I believe that with the recovery plan, many projects have come to Catalonia, not just the electric vehicle PERTE, but I also think there is a very strong chemical industry that has committed to decarbonization, and I think that's great news. And the industrial productive sector in general throughout the entire territory and also in Catalonia. And Catalonia has benefited, right, from this whole transition. New windows of opportunity will come. We are now talking about the new Horizon funds from 2027 onwards from the European Union. And I believe that in this field, we all have to work together to maximize the opportunities for the Spanish productive and industrial sector. But what I can say, just one fact, and I think it's very relevant, is the planning of the electrical grid for the 2020 to 2026 period. Looking ahead to 2026, the main factor in our country was generating electricity with renewable sources. In the new planning that we are now finalizing, looking ahead to 2030, the main factor is the industrial sector's consumption. In other words, industry that wants to decarbonize and wants to commit to this path because it understands that it is also a source of competitiveness. And I insist in my final thought, there is no discriminatory treatment. And that has been a principle that, as I mentioned, has also been endorsed by the Court of Auditors. And thank you also for your tone.
Thank you, Ms. Aagesen. Thanks also to Ms. Payares. Now it's Ms. Fernandez's turn. Ms. Fernandez, please proceed for the Socialist Parliamentary Group.
Thank you, Madam President. Good morning, Vice President. Thank you for appearing before this Senate committee. On behalf of my group, we also want to thank you for answering with rigor, with firmness, and also with the kindness that characterizes you. The questions that the different groups have raised here this morning. And also, well, as Ms. Payares said, you have had the chance to see what the modus operandi is like, right? Of some of the groups in this committee where, well, they make all kinds of remarks, insinuations, and judgments. I trust, Madam Chair, that my considerations and statements in this intervention will be regarded as alleged. If that is not the case, I expressly request that it be recorded from this moment before you call me to order, as is your duty. I was telling you that on some occasions you haven't been allowed to explain yourself or respond because, well, what some groups in this commission are looking for is not answers that clarify the facts, right? But rather, well, they want answers that fit into a story written in advance with a double standard that some people have with constant lessons about transparency and exemplary behavior, which they have turned into an obligation for others and just a simple recommendation for themselves. Look, this is the 7th investigative committee that has been held in this chamber. Very briefly, we, the Socialist Parliamentary Group, did not support it because, well, we understood that its purpose is based solely and exclusively on investigating those events that, according to the proposing party and other groups, are considered important with their work plan and their rules. We've mentioned this before, making it into something it's not. This commission has become a media spectacle and a partisan tool with the sole objective of wearing down and delegitimizing a government. But out of institutional respect, we appear before this and all investigative commissions. And furthermore, we do so with a constructive attitude and with the intention of clarifying the facts and, if applicable, determining any resulting political responsibilities. And in that context, we want to recall, as has already been discussed here this morning, have you mentioned it on any occasion? Also in the complex context of COVID-19, well, in 2020, the Spanish state activated a series of extraordinary mechanisms to support the productive sector and prevent massive job losses. Among these instruments, the role of SEPI stood out, which is the subject of this commission, and in particular, the creation of the Solvency Support Fund for strategic companies. As you know, I'm not going to tell you anything new. SEPI is a key instrument within the state that contributes to the social and economic development of the country, defining an industrial strategy and also contributing to the recovery and strengthening of the productive sector. It has more than 200 employees, and the group has over 87,000 people. Here we have talked on some occasions about the latest data affecting SEPI, about the good figures, where in 2025 the group achieved significant revenue. The all-time highs, records that were also reached by its portfolio of assets. And, well, the Solvency Support Fund for Strategic Companies, which, as you said, was endorsed by the European Commission and the Court of Auditors. Although here that report is constantly being questioned in the Court of Auditors and by the judiciary, the Court of Justice of the European Union, as you said, allowed us to maintain employment and this country's productive base. Saving at that time, in that situation, under such complex circumstances, Madam Vice President, more than 62,000 jobs. And to give you another fact, up to this moment, more than 65% of the total finance through that mechanism has already been recovered. There are companies that received the aid that have already fully repaid that loan, which I remind you, I insist, are loans. That's why I think it's essential to highlight once again the data that shows the strategic role that SEPI had at that time and also now in a very complex global situation. And of course, as we have done on other occasions, I want to thank the SEPI staff for their rigorous and professional work. Madam Vice President, you said it here this morning, so I think you will agree with me. That unedifying behavior, in addition to damaging institutions, also erodes citizens' trust in them. And the credibility of politics and of those of us who have actively participated in it at some point in our lives, with the resulting harm to the public interest. This morning, you have once again reaffirmed in this committee the firm commitment of the government of Spain and your own personal commitment to the public interest and to the law, showing us, as you have explained, how you carry out and have carried out your work as a public servant. With rigor, with transparency, with zero tolerance for corruption. You have repeated it on several occasions, pursuing if necessary and also sanctioning any indication of possible misconduct. She has made it clear to us that, well, as a member of BOCA, as a member of the Management Council, she did not have any kind of pressure, any kind of influence regarding her work within that body. It is limited to that. And I think it is debatable, of course. Yo creo que además, en un contexto... In our complex world where truth is often challenged and constant noise prevails. Polarization. Well, this is something we really can't allow, Madam, and above all, transparency must prevail. Look, you have explained it here this morning, but I would like you to briefly do so again, because in this committee, well, it is implied. And have we ever heard, and it seems that some groups suggest, that the fund might have been a government whim during that very complex time? So I would like to ask you if you could clarify this for us very briefly, because it's true that you have already mentioned it several times. How did the Business Support Fund work? And if you could give us your assessment, although you have already done so, but to reiterate, of the economic results in terms of employment, of what it meant to launch that fund.
Thank you very much, Madam. I would like to start by pointing out that we are indeed talking about an instrument of the FASE, as some of you have also mentioned, which was also used by other member states in a particularly difficult context. We are talking about a health crisis. We are talking about an economic crisis caused by COVID-19. All of this took place within a temporary aid framework enabled by the European Commission itself. In this case, I insist, the 27 member states implemented different actions and different measures. The European Commission itself had to make more than 1,300 decisions. These were identified throughout Europe. I'm not talking about Spain. More than 980 specific measures to help the economic and productive sectors. And we're talking about a total amount that amounted to 3.2 trillion euros mobilized in the European context. In this case, the FAS, as you know, had up to 10 billion euros that it could mobilize. It was endorsed by the European Court of Justice, the General Court of the European Union, and the Court of Auditors. I want to stress, I think the most important thing is that we were talking about eligibility criteria. 13 eligibility criteria with clearly defined roles for the dev team, SEPI, and the management board. With the possibility of having external advisors to assess the economic, financial, and legal viability of the actions that were taken and planned within, and additionally subject to external auditing. And an external audit that once again endorses each and every operation, both in terms of procedures and in terms of non-discriminatory treatment, a question that I think is fundamental. And also in terms of whether we had within the Council the necessary information to be able to make the decisions that were made in that context. You also mentioned we're talking about more than 3 billion euros that were granted to a total of 30 companies, of which in the end it was 28 companies. This is important, and 2 that were not. Thank you.
Madam, excuse me for a second, please. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask for silence as the Socialist Group is complaining. Thank you.
Go ahead, Minister. But above all, I want to highlight, to emphasize something that you have mentioned, that I have mentioned earlier. More than 60,000 jobs, practically 62,000 jobs were preserved despite COVID-19. What was most affected was people's health and so much loss of life, but also damage to the economy and productive sectors. And what we did, thanks to this fund, was to ensure that practically 62,000 workers could continue working. And I also want to highlight a figure that has also been mentioned. 1.7 billion, a little more than 1.7 billion, has returned to the public coffers, 65% of that funding that went to these companies. Guaranteed operations, operations that met the criteria, and operations in an extraordinarily complicated context where they were a last resort. In fact, why do I say they were a last resort? Because if they weren't a last resort, and if it was shown that they could access ordinary funding sources, they couldn't go to FASI. Well, this is a very, very quick summary in response to your question. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for your clarifications. Look, this morning the Management Council was also discussed here. Reports have been brought, various meetings have been held. I would also like you to briefly tell us and clarify what the role of the Management Council was within the scope of the fund itself.
Well, I have insisted on this point. The Management Council was involved at the end of a procedure. That is, it made decisions based on all the reports from the different institutions under SEPI, even from external advisors, as I have confirmed today in the hearing. The function was to make a decision based on all those reports and submit it for approval to the Council of Ministers. Those functions are fully regulated. Everyone, it's true that when all the reports were favorable, obviously the Council members had no discretion. It's just that we had clear information stating that it was favorable and that all the criteria for the rescue were being met. This is a very quick summary, the one I'm giving you now. Let me know if you want more details.
All right, thank you, Vice President. Look, today we've talked here about 3 specific companies that received the bailout, that received the aid. Air Europa, which you forgot to mention, is one of the companies that has returned. Sorry, every single bit of aid it received. Not just the principal, but also the interest. And also I think it has been more than proven that it met the requirements at that time. The eligibility requirements, the same goes for Plus Ultra. We've talked about Plus Ultra in this committee on several occasions. Some groups, or a particular group like the Vox group, seem to no longer be interested in this case. Maybe you should include in your next work plan, in your proposal for your next work plan, a hearing with a former magistrate who can also clarify some issues for us regarding this case. But I think it was proven at the time that Plus Ultra also met the requirements. The reports were there. It was also considered strategic. As I think has been mentioned in this committee, that was true not only of this company, but of the aviation sector as well. During the COVID period, it was considered or was regarded by the European Commission itself as a strategic sector. And I think that here, well, it was also shown that Plus Ultra met the requirements. It's true that they have only returned part of the aid, but, well, it seems that they are in negotiations, right, to be able to return the rest of the aid. They've also talked about Tubos Reunidos. I've gathered some information from that time. And I think that, well, at that time, the strategic relevance of that company was also considered because of the sector in which it operated and the impact it had on employment and the economy. At the end of 2021, it employed 1,400 people. We're talking about that moment. It's true that the company is now in a situation that I think everyone is aware of. And it also generated 7,000 indirect jobs when the aid was granted. I also think it's more than clear that the company Tubos Reunidos, it met the legal requirements that were demanded at the time the loan was granted from the fund. In the processing of its case file, well, according to the legally established procedure, and with absolute respect for all the technical and legal control mechanisms, right? Madam Vice President, look, I think you've been able to see it, and we've been seeing it in this committee, how the objectives of some groups here are, well, to sow doubt, right? About the legitimacy of a public body, which in your case is SEPI, an institution that, well, I want to remind you, has been supported since its creation. It had the support of all the governments of this country. Not only you, but I think various witnesses have made clear the role of SEPI, not only since its creation, but also in very complex moments, such as the pandemic and the current global situation we are experiencing right now, and, well, in particular, the usefulness and legality. Above all, the legality of the Solvency Support Fund. And it has also become clear how the granting or denial of support from the fund, it was the result of an economic and legal analysis carried out within the framework of an administrative procedure, after an exhaustive and rigorous process of analysis. Analysis of the company's situation, not only economic but also legal, and of the impact they suffered at that time due to COVID. And also of the viability plans they presented, and of the prospects, for how those companies were expected to develop at that time. Look, we believe that it is indeed legitimate and also necessary in a democratic country to oversee the actions of any public entity. You said it yourself. We also know this from some of the remarks you've made in this chamber here in Parliament about how your ministry has become involved and has put measures in place to prevent irregular conduct, above all as a preventive measure. And that you have become aware, right? They work rigorously and transparently in that regard. I think it's irresponsible, undoubtedly using that oversight as a tool to wear down and harass the government, as we believe is being done in this commission. And of course, this parliamentary group will not participate in it. Without further ado, I want to thank you again for your presence in this chamber. Your willingness to clarify and answer with the rigor I mentioned at the beginning, above all with that kindness and calmness that you never lose. And well, that you have made it clear to us that your actions within that management council were, I insist, rigorous. And always with respect for the law.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fernandez. Thank you as well, Madam Minister. And now, if you consider it appropriate, you have 3 minutes to make any remarks you deem necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. If I may, I won't use the 3 minutes. I believe it's important. I am here to respond, and that is what I have come to do for you. So I will now listen to you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Aagesen. The spokesperson for the parliamentary group now has the floor for 7 minutes. Oh, sorry, this happens to me all the time. So from smallest to largest, Ms. Gomez, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam President. To finish, I will be very brief, and I want to conclude by saying that you, ladies and gentlemen, and you as Minister of Ecological Transition, talk a lot about the green transition, about emissions, about sustainability, but all your supposed ecological morality suddenly disappears as soon as there are economic interests and political pressures involved. At that moment, your environmental dogmas take a back seat. In other words, you are selling a fraudulent public narrative. You are one of those responsible for this bailout, either with your delegated signature or with your change of stance in just 21 days or with your later capitulation. After all, you have been one of the necessary collaborators for this operation to take place. And I ask you really, Ms. Jesse, among all the high-ranking officials of the government present on the SEPI management board, was there not a single one who suspected that this public aid was at the very least strange? Did really none of them ever think that this bailout was strange? Do you really have nothing to say about this, Ms. Jesse?
Thank you. Your question, really? Not really. The procedure followed by the Management Council was completely rigorous and scrupulous in applying the 13 eligibility criteria. I repeat, that has been the responsibility and the work carried out by the members of the Management Council. Everything else that may have happened outside, as I have said, I will say it again and I repeat myself, zero tolerance for corruption. But don't mix up the issues. And one more thing, the utmost respect, and of course, you have before you a Minister for Ecological Transition who is respectful and deeply believes that this agenda is necessary out of responsibility and opportunity.
Well, I tell you that honestly, all of this seems more than strange, and with time we will see. They used the post-pandemic emergency funds to fuel schemes. And I say schemes because there was a lot. In the Puebla Ultra case, one person profited. In the Europa case, another profited. In the Abori case, someone else profited. And in the Tubos Reunidos case, yet another person profited. As far as we know, up to now, it just keeps adding up, turning a public oversight body into a benefit for these schemes. More. And I tell you, Ms. Angel Cesar, based on what you have told us here today before this commission, during your testimony, your strategy of looking the other way does not exempt you from any responsibility, and your time will come when you will have to testify in court. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you, Ms. Gomez. Now it's Ms. Payari's turn. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. I will not take the floor. I just want to thank you, Madam Minister, for your presence at this hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now it's Ms. Fernandez's turn. Go ahead.
Thank you again, Madam President. We have said on multiple occasions that as a parliamentary group, we do not question the legitimacy of investigative committees as instruments of oversight that are protected by the Spanish Constitution. And we understand that when they are used rigorously for the purposes of clarification and oversight, they strengthen institutions and improve the democratic quality of a country. When that's not the case, when they're distorted or conceived, not to clarify the facts, but for other purposes, such as fabricating political narratives exclusively serving partisan interests. When they become parallel courts with the sole function of serving as a loudspeaker for rumors, hoaxes, and even falsehoods. Because they stop serving the general interest, and as I said before, they even end up eroding citizens' trust in the institutions themselves. This is the 7th investigative committee that has been launched in this chamber as a tool that the Partido Popular has reinterpreted as one for political confrontation and to wear down the government, which in my opinion constitutes a threat to the democratic quality of our country, weakening, as I said before, the citizens' trust in institutions and moreover setting a very discouraging precedent. Madam Vice President, look, we socialists have argued before this committee that the strength of a democratic country is largely measured by the solidity of its public institutions. And in Spain, one of the clearest examples of that institutional framework, as we have seen and mentioned before, is SEPI, the State Industrial Holdings Company. It is an organization that serves as a strategic pillar for economic cohesion, industrial stability, and the defense of the general interest in our country. We remembered how the crisis caused by COVID put the resilience of this country's business and industrial fabric to the test. How? Was SEPI's intervention decisive? And through the Solvency Support Fund for Strategic Companies, it was decisive in supporting companies that were essential at that time for the national economy and for protecting jobs. But we mentioned a figure here. This morning, more than 62,000 jobs were saved with the implementation of this mechanism. And I think the usefulness and legality of it have become clear. The rigor of its implementation, the fulfillment of requirements by the benefiting companies, and the control and monitoring of the files. From the repayment of the loans, because we want to remind you that these are loans, all of this, I insist, has been validated by the European Commission, the Court of Auditors, and the Court of Justice of the European Union. But look, there are groups that are not interested. To know the true management of SEPI, to know its results, which are extraordinary, and to understand its role as a necessary and efficient instrument within this country's strategic policy. They also aren't interested in how, under a socialist government, our country is experiencing one of the best periods in its history. According to the forecasts of some international organizations, Spain will once again be the fastest growing major economy in the Eurozone in 2026 and 2027. How the policies of this government have led us to historic highs in job creation, surpassing 22.4 million people registered with Social Security for the first time in our history. And these figures are not the result of chance, but of government action that has allowed our country to move toward a more balanced, competitive, and resilient development model, which is also capable, as you have mentioned on occasion, of facing global challenges and seizing the opportunities of a constantly changing world. Why aren't they interested in knowing all this? Because we are dealing with some parties, like the Popular Party, that lack a political project for this country, that is only interested in building a narrative parallel to judicial proceedings, continuously creating an atmosphere of suspicion and guilt that only serves to favor their political interests, which reveals not only a way of doing politics, but also their own understanding of what democracy and the functioning of institutions are. Madam Vice President, I deeply regret that you had to appear before this committee, but I believe that your intervention here this morning has more than proven your proper conduct at the time as Secretary of State for Energy on the Fund's Management Board. Once again, your firm commitment to the law and to the public interest has also been made clear, showing us, as I mentioned earlier, that you have always carried out your work as a public servant with rigor and transparency and with zero tolerance for corruption. You have repeated it on numerous occasions, pursuing and sanctioning possible illegal conduct, with the utmost respect for the ongoing judicial procedures and with full cooperation with the justice system. And without a doubt, that's what we need in this country. Institutions and people who work with integrity, thinking about the common good, as you do and as the government of Spain does as well. Because look, the socialists, we believe in the strength of democracy, based on the separation of powers and institutional respect, which I have mentioned several times. And that strength is measured, as I said before, by the solidity of public institutions. And when doubt is cast on their legitimacy, when they are used as a tool for partisan attacks and political confrontation, as is being done, it sends an image of fragility that generates distrust among citizens. And I believe that is not in our interest as a society. And you won't find us there, ladies and gentlemen. You won't find this parliamentary group, because we understand that standing up for the public sector, defending institutions like SEPI, preserving their prestige and strength, and improving them, and also valuing the work and honor of thousands of public servants is without a doubt an exercise in democratic responsibility. I will finish, Madam President, by once again thanking the third Vice President of the government for appearing and especially for her explanations within this committee.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fernandez. Mr. Hernando has the floor to conclude this committee session.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. Ms. Aagesen, do you think there is a dark shadow hanging over the Mítico, hanging over you? Because earlier I started by saying that a week ago we woke up to the indictment of 25 names related to the PSOE scandals, and today we woke up to another one, with another branch of this scheme connecting to Eruroc and thus to Vicente Fernandez, Ler, and Anchón Aronso, with Forestalia, with SEPI, with the renowned Eugenio Dominguez, whom you must know, your Director General of Environmental Assessment in your ministry, who allegedly seems to have taken 5 million in kickbacks using his position to favor Forestalia's speculative interests at the expense of the environment in Spain. And also, since he couldn't finish the job because he retired, he was later hired in a level 30 advisor position to complete his work, I believe, by your colleague Hugo Morin. The new player in this comedy, which we've learned about today, is called Next Generation Calliope and Nova. Honestly, they're unique when it comes to naming things in this scheme, which joins Mediciones Martinez and Servinada, which may have been used in Sepi's patrimonial company's business. Pires with Arapele from Forestalia for an amount of 17.5 million euros in exchange for an alleged kickback of 200,000 euros for the benefit of Vicente Fernandez, Zanchon, Alonso, and Leredias. The truth is that everything turns out to be extraordinarily uplifting in his ministry. Your Director General for Quality and Environmental Assessment, Marta Gomez Paneque, under whose supervision Eugenio Domingos acted, is also under investigation for alleged misconduct in the environmental process of the Tagus photovoltaic plant in Cáceres. But as far as we know, she's still there after this indictment and after having had Eugenio Dominguez under her authority. Look, these schemes even reach my city, Soria. Look, a councilwoman from the PSOE, who at least had the decency to resign, unlike others, was arrested and indicted in connection with her company Biosfera, which is dedicated to socio-environmental work. An 11-hour search by the UCO, unprecedented, in the Soria City Hall, truly scandalous. And being arrested, one of them, in fact a civil servant, head of section at Mitico, though we don't know whether the ministry itself is implicated or not. And Mr. Angel, aside from what has been discussed here, one day you will have to explain the issues regarding aid and subsidies that members of your family have benefited from. To your older brother, 2 million with 8 million in contracts from Sánchez's government, your husband's and your younger brother Eric's small business, which received 400,000 euros in aid, you have given no explanation. I believe you can provide the explanations, but it's important they are given. And getting into the heart of the matter, first of all, it has been a failure, no matter how you tell it. Out of the 10 billion, only a third has been mobilized, which is a stark contrast with the rest of the European Union states you mentioned, who have mobilized, first of all, much more money from the start and have been able to use it precisely for the funds. But look, 4 out of every 10 euros that have been mobilized are under judicial scrutiny, that is, under suspicion. That is, there are more millions of euros under suspicion than have been returned so far. But in any case, it seems clear, in view of how the hearing has developed, that we have been much more useful to you than you have been to us. Us, you should buy us a meal. Because you practically have no idea about anything. You don't know if the reports were signed. You haven't read or reviewed the minutes. We found out that there are some reports that are more developed and others that are less developed. I suppose the one from Plus Ultra, which came directly from the Venezuelan regime, must have been very well developed. And yet, we have informed you of things that apparently you didn't know. First, that Europa was a financial company, Europa Holding, and that the matter was also handled in record time, and that the external financing company charged 1 cent of a euro. This must have been a very well-developed file indeed, but there was interference going on that you knew nothing about from the Avalos network. As for Plus Ultra, well, you should also thank us for letting you know things like the fact that it was in the process of dissolution, that it didn't meet the requirements of not being a company in crisis. According to 2018, basically the company's own auditor said it, and because the expert made it clear here. As for Tubos Reunidos, well, we thank you for the news that there was no one there on June 15th. They were absent from a meeting related to one of the most important bailouts as well, 113 million, and there was no one from Miteco, no one representing you, despite its importance. Interestingly, Tubos Reunidos. It is a company that poses serious problems regarding environmental aspects. I suppose that was exclusively why the Secretary of State for Industry was representing Metico on that management board. And then, for the meeting where the vote takes place, you show up or send the Undersecretary. You know that the Undersecretary of the Ministry is the manager. He takes care of the cars, the buildings, and so on. He doesn't get involved in matters related to the core business of the Ministry. The truth is that you use your technocratic profile very well to avoid taking a stance, but in this case, the technocratic profile hasn't helped us at all either, because you haven't given us any information that's relevant regarding the reports. As I said, we were the ones who provided it. and I believe you are perfectly aware of the ground you were standing on in the Management Council. We have the idea that the Management Council was a political instrument to achieve, where appropriate, objectives linked to schemes that are currently being investigated. And the problem is that you, whether you like it or not, bear all the responsibility, first the political responsibility, for what happens. But look, if tomorrow it turns out that the schemes lead to convictions, which is the most likely outcome, there will only be two possibilities. Either you and your colleagues on the council were absolutely incompetent, committing a blatant negligence for which you shouldn't remain in your positions for even a minute longer, or you were complicit by omission of the public duties of care that you should have applied in the performance of your functions. Those are the only two possibilities that exist, either incompetence or complicity. And I think that in the end, that's the feeling we're left with. You basically haven't answered any of the questions. You have resorted to claims of ignorance and misinformation, which I find quite disappointing coming from you. And I repeat, this will not save you from the responsibility that may be determined in your case. In any case, I appreciate your presence and your courteous tone. You have indeed been very kind, but you have not been rigorous at all, I'm sorry to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hernando. Thank you also to the Vice President, Ms. Aagesen. The session is adjourned.